Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, and it's very exciting because we're on part 4 of our story tonight, and we have learned that Yvette had a daughter called Riley, and Riley was a very impressionable young girl, only about 7 years old, and Yvette welcomed a man into her life who was a trucker. And this man was very stubborn, and he had a mind of his own and was a keen hunter. And he went off in a huff into the woodgrove one night because Yvette and him had a nasty fight. And, well, at least a misunderstanding perhaps. As he goes into the wood, he notices a Bigfoot, and he comes back to shoot the Bigfoot and does not succeed in his endeavours. So during the night, the trailer home is attacked. Boris goes out there to try and shoot 3 Bigfoot with no success whatsoever because they simply bounce out of the way of his bullets. And he has an interaction with a Bigfoot who literally warns him off and says, if you do this again, you're dead, literally. So the Bigfoot was very compassionate towards Boris because he certainly didn't show the same level of compassion towards the Bigfoots. We're about to find out a little bit more about Boris. So let's continue with our story, but before we start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and you know I love it when you leave compliments. It makes a huge, comments. I hope they're compliments, but comments anyway, because basically comments make the world of difference. So sometimes the most dreadful YouTube videos out there, because they get all these, nasty comments, get so much exposure simply because of the comments. So your comments really help get me exposed, and I appreciate that very much. So let's continue with part 4 of our story. When Yvette arrived at the hospital with a bag of grapes in a brown paper bag, along with a man's health magazine that she knew that Boris would like, she had in mind to tell Boris that once he was discharged from the hospital, that it was over between the two of them. She was rather apprehensive about how he was going to react to being dumped, as Boris had quite the ego on him. She tentatively entered the lift until she reached the 2nd floor, and rather hesitantly made her way to the ward, passing the nursing station, where the nurses assured her that Boris was indeed receiving visitors, and was up and about doing rather well, although literally contained in bed, as he couldn't exactly move around, given the condition of his legs. Leslie peered through the ward. She observed a woman with 2 children standing over Boris's bed. The woman was holding Boris's hand, stroking his hair tenderly away from his face. Her behaviour was over-familiar, but she was too young to be Boris's mother. So who was she? Could she be one of Boris's 3 sisters? Yvette was not sure that she was. She overheard the woman talking very, very gently to Boris. "You poor thing, darling. I can't believe this happened to you. How on earth did you break your leg? You took quite the tumble, didn't you?" "I told you, love, I can't remember," said Boris, looking very sorry for himself. "I just recall falling. That was it." "Is Daddy going to be all right?" said the little boy, looking very concerned. Yvette could not believe what she had heard. It felt she was intruding on a family scene. In a moment of unbridled confidence, she trotted over to Boris's bed, with a large, friendly smile on her face. It gave her a measure of rather smug satisfaction to see his skin drain of all its colour when he saw her. "What are you doing here?" he asked almost accusingly, his face growing as red as a field of poppies. "Who are you?" asked the woman, looking up at Yvette, who was holding the brown paper bag of grapes in her hands, along with the rolled-up magazine, which she presented to Boris. "I'm Yvette, and who are you?" "I'm Boris's wife. Boris has never mentioned an Yvette to me before. How do you know my husband?" Yvette could see that Boris was physically squirming. He was looking at her pleadingly, as if to say, "Don't tell her. Please don't tell her who you are." "I'm just the doctor around here," said Yvette, choosing to lie for reasons she couldn't even explain. Maybe she didn't want to hurt the kids in Boris's family. by revealing to them the bitter truth of who she actually was. "Oh, it's a relief to be able to speak to a doctor finally," said the woman. "I'm so sorry I didn't realize you were the doctor, but you weren't wearing a white coat. I've been wondering when I could speak to someone about my husband's condition. I'm terribly worried about Boris. I've no idea what really happened to him, and neither does he. But he's injured his leg rather badly. Very bad break, I believe it was. I'm concerned because he travels long distance by truck, hauling freight. Will he be all right to resume his job?" "Boris is going to be fine. I'm sure he'll be able to resume his job once he's back on his feet. He did very well in the operation, you'll be glad to know." "But how long will that be?" asked Boris's wife. "It's very important, doctor. My husband earns a living as a trucker. He can't afford to have his job compromised. I'm sure you appreciate that." "Of course I understand, ma'am." Yvette thought about her leg when she'd broken it and said, "I'd say about 6 weeks or so." "Well, I suppose that's not too bad. He can recuperate at home once he's discharged from the hospital. Thank you, doctor." Yvette gave Boris a wink and smiled at both Boris's wife and their 2 children. And she said, "The main thing is he's going to be fine." "I'd better be doing my rounds now," said Yvette. "I must go." Yvette practically skipped out of the hospital, knowing in her heart she would never see Boris again, and it felt as if a heavy load had been lifted off her life. She had known in her heart she couldn't trust the man, and now he had no excuse to come crawling back to their trailer home, because he wasn't stupid. He knew Yvette would never take him back, now that she knew he was a married man. Besides, he was physically incapacitated at the moment, and would have to physically recover at home, with his wife and his 2 children. She had received a message from him on her cell phone, saying thanks and I'm sorry. It had taken Yvette a couple of weeks to persuade her daughter that the horrifying events of the night, when she'd seen a Bigfoot's face at the window, were never ever going to be repeated again. "Riley," said Yvette, taking her daughter lovingly in her arms, "I need you to listen to me, love. Boris did a very stupid thing when he was living with us. He went into the woods and tried to kill a Bigfoot with his rifle. You can see how intimidating and big those things are. The Bigfoot was grievously upset with Boris and came back with reinforcement in the form of 2 friends to shake our mobile home to get his message across. He was grievously upset, and you saw his face at the window looking in at you. And that was very scary. I know it was. Then you saw the Bigfoot throwing Boris to the ground. And, of course, Boris broke his leg. But he's recovering very well. He did that to Boris because he was angry. Wouldn't you be angry if someone tried to hurt you?" Riley seemed to think about this for a moment, and she nodded, but she remained as mute as ever. "Well, there you go, then. The Bigfoot did break some of Boris's bones, but it didn't kill him, did he? That Bigfoot could have killed Boris, but he didn't. So we have nothing to fear. Do you understand?" Riley nodded. "Oh, Riley, I do wish you would speak, love. I really do. I don't understand why you still don't say a single word. But anyway, the Bigfoots are like us, aren't they? They're not going to hurt us without very good reason. We're safe living here. You've been gone for 2 weeks, and while you've been staying with your Aunt Leslie, nothing untoward has happened here. Everything has been very quiet and peaceful at the trailer park. The trailer has not rocked or anything. Those Bigfoots want to live in peace, and if we respect that, they'll respect us in turn. Do you understand, Riley?" Riley nodded again. "I know you like Boris, love, and it is upsetting that he's not coming back. I made a very big mistake asking him to live with us. He had secrets, you see, love. He's married and he has 2 children. When I went to the hospital, I met them all. He lied to us. He wasn't a single man. We could never have got married, but I wouldn't have married him anyway." Riley's eyes grew round. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm sorry, love.
I know it's dreadfully upsetting for you. You really loved Boris, didn't you? And you fancied him as a father. But it is what it is." Yvette could have sheltered her daughter from the truth. But what was the point? In her experience, it was a whole lot better to be honest with your children. But the dreadful reality was that after the inauspicious event, Riley appeared to have lost the ability to speak. It would seem Dr. Finneason was sure that Riley had been traumatized. But there was no way on God's earth that Yvette would reveal to the doctor what had happened that night. If she related her unlikely story to him, he'd probably think she belonged in a loony bin. Yvette knew very well there were some things you did not share. In the weeks that followed, the social services visited the trailer home, sniffing over her like a cadaver dog over a dead body, and asking her hundreds of invasive questions. The doctors had found nothing physically wrong with Riley to explain her muteness. Every week she was seeing a psychologist, but it would seem no one could get to the bottom of why Riley was no longer talking.
Riley's account. I am 20 years old now, but like many people, when I look back on my life as a 7-year-old girl, I don't remember terribly much. However, there is one big exception to that rule. I do recall the bodeful events that traumatized me so much that I lost the ability to speak and was mute for several months. I believe no matter how young you are, if you're exposed to a traumatic event of any kind, you will not forget that experience in a hurry. It leaves behind its cloyingly indelible scars that are as hard to shake off as the fleas off a dog's coat. Growing up, my mother did not have much money, but she worked incredibly hard for a living, and we had a great life together. She was a selfless, sacrificial person who put me over and above everything else in her life. She would always tell me I was the best thing that had ever happened to her, even though I was an unexpected surprise that she had never seen coming. I knew from an early age that my father, who'd been my mother's first love, had abandoned her when she became pregnant with me. My mother said he was young at the time, and having a child at his age would have scared him half to death, so he ran away from our sleepy little town. I would often lie in bed longingly and say, "Dad, where are you? Please don't forget about me." But I was sure he'd never hear my pleas. I so wanted to be like the other children at school and have a father. I think when my mother began to date Boris, I saw a light at the end of the tunnel, a glimmer of hope, I suspect. I knew that if they both got married, I would be like all the other children at school and also have a father. At 7 years old, that was what I wanted more than anything else in the entire world. When I sent off my request to Santa Claus every year, it was always a wish to have a father. I wasn't interested in a brand new doll or a pretty Cinderella dress. All I wanted was a father, nothing more and nothing less. When Boris moved into our trailer, I was as pleased as Punch. I thought it must mean that my mother was very serious about the relationship, for she had never made a habit of bringing men home with her. When I asked her if she was going to marry Boris, I could see she didn't want to, so I felt bitterly disappointed. I genuinely liked Boris. He'd give me piggyback rides, play hide and seek with me, buy me nice things. Sometimes I even pretended he was my father. Boris was never around much. He was a trucker. My mother would say he was out on the open road hauling freight to different states. But whenever he came home to the trailer, I always was pleased to see him. As a 7-year-old child, I never ever compared myself to the more privileged kids who came from wealthier backgrounds than I did, or who lived in better homes than me. I never considered such things as desperately important. I genuinely believed that I had life very good, and that I wasn't deluding myself, because I really did. If you're a frog that grows up in a small pond all your life, and you've never been in a large pond before, why would you be sad about your circumstances when you feel safe and secure exactly where you are? My mother worked hard for a living, waiting tables at the gourmet gallery. We never wanted for anything. Our trailer was sumptuously cosy. It was also freshly painted on the outside, as my Aunt Leslie kept it in pristine condition for us. She spent a lot of money on our trailer, turning it into an enviable little home,
which even my friends thought was incredibly cool. Aunt Leslie would say that you could create beauty in small spaces, and she was not wrong about that. Our trailer was located in the sequestered part of the park, overlooking a farmer's field of ponies, and opposite a heavily wooded area consisting of tall, lofty trees. The woods belonged to the owner of the trailer park, Mr. Bob Farble, who had hinted that one day the land would be bulldozed to make way for a housing development, from which he claimed he'd make his vast fortune. And when that happened, we'd all have to say goodbye to our trailer homes. I think Mr. Bob Farble was all talk and no action. He was one of those people. I'm glad to say that his ambitions never occurred. I suspect they were rather muted. And even though the trailer park no longer exists today, the land remains beautifully preserved and unspoilt. Every morning I would feel like I was on holiday. I would wake up surrounded by such incredible beauty, as there were so many indigenous wild animals that would frolic happily around the property, and being an animal lover, I thoroughly enjoyed watching the cute little visitors that would scamper around, from foxes to rabbits, deer, and even mountain lions. On one occasion a mountain lion and her 2 cubs were playing around our trailer home, and I watched them for many hours. I was never afraid. They were incredibly beautiful. I felt privileged to grow up in this part of the world. I knew some of the other trailers at the park were dilapidated, run down and in pretty bleak condition. And there were, of course, unsavoury characters living in some of those trailers, who drank to excess, smoked weed and took drugs. But I never hung around them. Sometimes they could be rather rowdy. And there were times on the wind I would hear drunken laughter or people having a slanging match together, calling each other rather gross, unsavoury names. We were very lucky to have our trailer cocooned so far away from the other residents that it was like we lived a world away from everyone. It had been my mother's ingenious idea to ask Mr. Bob Farble for our trailer to be located opposite the field of ponies, and against all the odds, with a slight increase in our rent, he had agreed to her request. So my mother lived by the age-old adage, if you don't ask, you don't get, and she was absolutely right. I do, however, think Bob Farble had a soft spot for my mother. He could see she was a single working mum who didn't drink, smoke or do drugs, so I think he went out of his way to help her. My mother believed he just liked the extra rent, but I begged to differ. I remember one man living at the trailer park. When he was drunk, he kept beating up his wife. She'd go to hospital regularly, pretending she'd walked into the door, but I doubt anyone believed her claims. People aren't stupid, you know. Everyone knew exactly what was going on in her trailer, and I could never comprehend why the wife didn't leave the husband. But my mother would always say that maybe she didn't have anywhere else to go. When she said that, I felt incredibly sorry for the woman, having to live with her abuser, and never knowing when her husband was going to bite her head off next. On several occasions the police were called around to the property. I preferred to stay well away from people like that, living in the other trailers, to distance myself from them. So I would play with myself in the woods, and from a very early age I always felt as if I was being watched. I would tell myself I was imagining things, of course, that there was nobody there, but the feeling of being watched always persisted. I had heard strange sounds in the woods at times, chattering in a peculiar language that I could not discern, whistling, grunting, and wood-knocking. But being so young and impressionable, I just brushed those experiences away, as if they were a few hairs on a winter coat. One evening Boris returned home, with a big bag of groceries in his hands, and a huge smile on his face. He'd been out on the open road and was exhausted and very weary from the long journey. He told us he was going to spend the next 3 days with us. He began to prepare a barbecue, so we could enjoy eating our food under the stars. I was thrilled at this suggestion, as everything eaten out of doors and cooked over open flames tastes so much better. I eagerly set to work preparing some salads, my speciality being potato salad, which is always very creamy, so my mother let me make it with the cold potato pieces in the fridge. It was the best feeling in the world, sitting under the gilded canopy of the showy stars on a rather tenebrific but warm summer's night, surrounded by the delicious smells of our barbecue. I was famished, The delicious smells the barbecue was giving off had whetted my appetite, and I got my fingers all covered in gummy goo as I began to eat my chops with my fingers. In the beginning, my mother was talking to Boris, asking him some questions about his day out on the road. Something she said really upset him, as he quickly got up from his camping chair, grabbed a torch and barged off into the woodgrove, saying he was going to take a walk. It was the first and last time I saw Boris angry. It upset me to see him so mad. When he returned from his walk, me and my mother were finishing our meal, but Boris failed to acknowledge us. Instead, he barged right past us, as if we weren't even there. I don't think he was deliberately ignoring us. It was almost like he was cocooned in his own little world, and he almost forgot that we existed in it. Moments later, Boris left the trailer, moving very fast. He'd retrieved his rifle and headed straight back into the woods. My mother was livid. She knew that even though it was illegal, Boris had obviously decided to go hunting. I think she thought it was his way of letting off steam after the argument they had had. He probably needed some space to cool down. Maybe hunting was an outlet for him, to distract himself from thinking too much. But he was not supposed to be doing it on Bob Farble's property. We thought he might be hunting raccoons, or even rabbits. We couldn't be sure. But the expression on his face seemed to say that he meant business. I was upset that Boris would kill anything. I loved animals myself, and hated the thought of them being killed, which made me a bit of a hypocrite, as I seriously love red meat. But I prefer not to know where it comes from, because if I do, I might not be able to eat it. Shortly after Boris had sauntered into the woodgrove, we heard gunshots going off in the woods. My mother said out loud to me, "Right, that's it. I've had enough of that man. It's over between us." It really scared me to hear my mother talk like that. I knew she was going to end her relationship with Boris. I did not want that to happen. Boris was the nearest thing I'd had to a father. It was with a heavy heart and with low spirits I reluctantly returned to bed that night, certain that by the morning Boris would be gone from our lives. I tossed and turned in bed, unable to fall asleep. All of a sudden I heard muted voices. A conversation was going on outside our trailer. It sounded as if 3 people were having a long discussion together in a foreign language. Someone was out there, I thought. I wondered if someone from the trailer park was hanging outside our home. I sat up in bed with a start. The whole trailer began to shake and wobble, and that was when I saw the face at the window, with bright yellow eyes staring in at me. I was so terrified that my entire body convulsed. According to my mother, I screamed, but I have no memory of that at all. All I could recall was the haunting face at my window, staring in at me. That I could never forget. Once again the trailer began to wobble and shake precariously. I truly thought it was going to topple over on its side. I heard Boris yelling something. I think he said something like, "This stops right now. I'm coming after you." He was furious. He got his rifle and charged out of the trailer door. We followed close behind, watching what he was going to do. There was a wall of 3 Bigfoots standing side by side, their eyes clearly focused on us. These things were so terrifying. They were like giants. They made me feel like an ant in their midst. I got the impression that the Bigfoots had banged on our trailer to make us come out. They wanted us to know what Boris had done, randomly firing shots at one of the Bigfoots earlier on in the evening in the woods, and they wanted us to know it was not acceptable behaviour. My mother later told me what he'd done. I don't know what on earth was wrong with Boris, but he was absolutely fixated on those Bigfoots. I mean, he paid no heed or attention to any common sense whatsoever. I was 7 years old, and even at that tender young age, I knew we were no match for those Bigfoots. Boris began shooting indiscriminately at them from the front door of our trailer, almost as if he was clay pigeon shooting. It was absolutely ridiculous. My mother tried to stop him, of course she did, but he refused to listen to a word she was saying. She was shouting at the top of her lungs, "Stop! They're going to kill us, Boris! You've got to stop! Stop, Boris!" The Bigfoots were not remotely afraid. I mean, why would they be? We were nothing to them. We were tiny in their sight. They stood perfectly still, nimbly bouncing out of the way of any moving bullets, as if they could accurately predict the trajectory. Their reaction time was so fast. I was incredibly impressed because I'd never seen anything like it before. Boris was an excellent shot, but his bullets made him look like he'd never fired a shot a day in his life. He looked like a novice at the sport. At this point, I was absolutely terrified. I felt certain that the Bigfoots were going to kill us. Boris had tried to take them out. Now they wanted revenge. I was sure of it. I remember a Herculean-sized Bigfoot lunging towards Boris, grabbing him by a powerful arm. I closed my eyes. I was terrified about what was going to happen next. He was so close to Boris that when I opened my eyes, I noticed his burning eyes were blazing with indignation. But even though he was angry, he seemed to be in full control of his emotions, which Boris was not. I watched as his massive, powerful hands, with fingers the size of sausages, effortlessly broke Boris's rifle, throwing it on the ground, where it was buried in the long grass. Now we were all completely helpless, at the mercy of 3 powerful Bigfoots, fully aware of our own vulnerability, knowing full well that within the next few seconds we might be obliterated from the face of the earth, to be remembered no more. Even at 7, in those vital seconds, I knew death was imminent. I often wondered why we did not run back into our trailer home, shut the door behind us, bolting it after us, calling for help, but we did none of those things. It was like we were frozen in time-space, like 2 figures on a Monopoly board, waiting to see what would happen next at the throw of a dice. Seconds seemed like hours, as the Bigfoot threw Boris on the ground. I heard a loud snapping sound. Boris was wincing in pain, clutching his leg, looking up at the Bigfoot with absolutely terrified eyes. I think he thought he was a dead man. I thought he was too, as did my mother, and that ultimately we would be next. But nothing happened in the way that we'd envisaged. The male Bigfoot, with his powerful tree-trunk-sized legs, stood over Boris, looking down at him. He appeared to be saying something to him, without any audible words, but what he was saying was a dialogue that happened between only Boris and the Bigfoot. I'm sure the Bigfoot was telling him telepathically not to mess with him. Seconds later, as if nothing had happened, those 3 Bigfoots glided away, and that was that. My mother immediately went over to help Boris, who was swearing furiously. My mother kept telling him he was lucky to be alive, and he should thank God he had not been finished off by that powerful Bigfoot. You could have been killed. You're very lucky he didn't kill you. He showed mercy on you, Boris. If I'd been him, I'm not sure I would. I could see my mother's attitude towards Boris had shifted exponentially. I knew unequivocally that once he was ferried off to hospital, I would never see him again. I was to later learn that Boris was living a double life. It would seem he had a wife and kids. He wanted to have his cake and eat it. When I heard about his treachery, I didn't feel sad he'd left our lives after all. I felt as betrayed as my mother did. My mother would say that she was glad Boris was no longer around. But there were moments when I believed she was lonely. I knew the setback with Boris would likely put Mum off men for the rest of her life, so the hopes of having a father grew increasingly dim for me. I'm not going to be taken for a mug again, my mother would say. I knew that man was living a secret life. I should never have got involved with him. Why did I listen to Angelica? It was after that terrifying event I became mute. My mother sent me to doctors. We had social services visiting our home, asking my mother a plethora of awkward questions. I went to see a specialist for a physical evaluation, and when they found nothing physically wrong with me, I was then referred to a psychologist. But despite all my lengthy sessions with her, I remained steadfastly mute. But all that changed when Eleanor Parkins came to stay with me. Eleanor Parkins was not like me in any way. Her parents were reasonably wealthy, and I'm not sure her mother was remotely impressed that her 8-year-old daughter had gravitated towards the likes of me. I know she tried to get her daughter to befriend the richer kids at school, but her efforts failed, as kids tend to choose their own friends for themselves, with or without their parents' approval. Eleanor was a feisty little girl, with a bright, sharp mind of her own, and she was mulishly stubborn as well. If you told her the sky was red, and she believed it was blue, there was no talking her around. When Eleanor decided I was to be her best friend, even though I was mute, there was not much her parents could do about the problem. They couldn't stop her from making her own choices. "Riley's my best friend. I don't want to play with other kids," she would say. "I want to play with Riley." I remember it was over a long weekend that her parents were going away. Eleanor begged her mother to let her stay with me. At first her mother said no, but then she decided to pay the Calder Clare trailer park a visit. It was when she visited my mother's pristine trailer that overlooked the field of ponies and had tea with my mother. She finally agreed to let Eleanor stay with me. She told Eleanor she believed my mother was a very capable woman, and the trailer was in impeccable condition, that she felt safe leaving Eleanor in my mother's charge, although I dare say she had a rather grim view of the other occupants in the trailer park. The great thing about Eleanor was she accepted my muteness without any questions. But then that's kids for you, isn't it? They're so much more accepting of strange things than adults are. The kids at school simply believed I didn't care to talk, and they accepted that, as if it was the most normal and natural thing in the entire world. They'd say things like, "Riley doesn't like to talk, she likes to be quiet." I couldn't believe my luck when Eleanor came to stay with me. I'd always fancied a sister, and for the next 3 days I could pretend we were family. I wanted to make sure that Eleanor would come back and stay with me again. So me and my mother had to show her a great time, so she'd have many more sleepovers at our home. "I can't believe my mummy said I could stay here," said Eleanor. "She was going to say no when she saw the other trailers in the park. But when she saw yours, she changed her mind because your trailer is so nice." I do remember when Eleanor stayed at our trailer for the first day. We would spend ages in the fields together, with the ponies. One of the grooms who looked after the ponies would always smile at me warmly and greet me. On several occasions, he'd give me a ride on one of the ponies, leading it around the field with me on its back. The groom's name was Lincoln. He had been working for the rancher Bill Murray for over 10 years, and was previously from Arizona. He assured me that Bill Murray did not mind me attending to his ponies, because the man loved children. When Lincoln saw me in the field with Eleanor, stroking the ponies together, he took us for a ride. We both were delighted. We sat on the same pony together, and Lincoln led us around the field. Later we fed the ponies with a huge box of apples that Eleanor had brought. My favourite pony was a greedy mare I called Gutsy, as she always wanted all the apples. But her real name was Pleiades, which I was told was one of the planets in our star system. The owner of all the horses was fixated about stars, so all of his ponies were named after stars in the night sky. When I look back at those happy days, I smile, because Eleanor came from an opulent lifestyle, where she had so much. But that girl genuinely envied me. She thought I was the one who had life so good, living in an open space, in what she described as a cushy den, surrounded by a field and trees. In her eyes, I was the one with the greatest riches. It's amazing how different you see things through a child's eyes. I believed she was right. In my opinion, I was a millionaire, because it's not just money that makes you rich. It was on the second day that Eleanor persuaded me to play hide-and-seek in the woods with her. A year had gone by since the grisly incident with Boris and the Bigfoots, but I was still mute, and not even the psychologists could find out why I was like this. But it was agreed that I'd undergone some kind of trauma. Since then I'd never been into the woodgrove on my own, but my friend's enthusiasm was infectious, and I didn't want to disappoint her, even though I was terribly afraid of going into the woods. I just nodded my head in agreement. Little did I know that going into the woods would change my life, and bring a happy smile back to my mother's face, and reassurance to the concerns of many of my teachers. But to the kids, I would be like the little girl that didn't want to talk, who just changed her mind. I do vividly remember it was summer. I can even recall what I was wearing, a pretty sundress. The weather was fine, the sky as blue as a cornflower, The lofty trees in the grove were bedecked with their leafy splendour, covered in lush foliage. We were lucky. The owner of the property who owned the trailer park lived on this land, further away in a big farmhouse that was tucked neatly away against some undulating foothills. The property boasted ponds, streams and creeks. The owner of the trailer park, for some reason, kept the paths in the woodgrove clear to create riding trails for his family to use, and so the paths through the trees were pretty clear and rather useful for us. On occasion I had seen riders trekking through the woods, but all was quiet on this unassuming morning. I was a tad apprehensive, I don't mind admitting, especially when we first entered the woods. I kept thinking of the large face with the yellow eyes staring at me from the window. Was the owner of those eyes in the woods now, I wondered? My nervousness soon dissipated, as Eleanor's enthusiasm became infectious.
"Oh, it's so cool in here! You're so lucky to have woods on your property. I'll count and then you can hide."
In earnest we began our game of hide and seek, and once again the feeling of being watched overcame me. When it was my second turn to begin hiding again, Eleanor began counting.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
That was when I saw a dark figure moving towards me. I was about to scream, but the figure indicated for me to be quiet. I was staring at a female Bigfoot. She was looking at me with dark, shining eyes, and I heard her saying in my head, "I'll show you where you can hide, and your friend won't find you." She beckoned for me to hide between two halves of a tree, and began to arrange some leafy foliage around me so that I could not be easily detected. All the while she chuckled, her eyes meeting mine. I began to giggle as well. In that moment, I realized I'd been afraid of nothing. The Bigfoots really did not mean us any harm. It was Boris who had provoked them to anger, and rightly so. This female Bigfoot was helping me hide from my friend, and my heart swelled with pride.
"I'm coming now, whether you're ready or not,"
came Eleanor's voice. She began frantically searching for me, and was growing increasingly frustrated when she couldn't find me. I heard the female Bigfoot chuckle. In the end, my friend gave up.
"I can't find you anywhere. Where are you? This is getting boring. I can't find you."
"I'm over here," I said, revealing to her my hiding place. Eleanor was more than a little nonplussed. She wrinkled her brow as she frowned.
"How did you manage to cover yourself with all that foliage?" she asked.
To her amazement, I actually answered her.
"Wouldn't you like to know?"
I teased. Eleanor's mouth dropped open.
"You're speaking, Riley! You're speaking!"
As we walked away from the woods, I glanced over my shoulders, and the female Bigfoot was standing by the trees nodding at me. I remember feeling so happy that she was my friend. I do vividly recall that this was a year of many miracles, starting from when I was able to speak again, and everything else in my life began to change. One day a large red Toyota Cruiser drove up to our trailer. A handsome-looking man climbed out of his car. Even though I'd never seen him before a day in my life, he looked somewhat familiar to me, as if I knew him in some way. I ran over to him to ask him who he was, as my mother was not expecting any guests. The young man was looking around rather nervously. He asked me if my mother was around. "I'm an old friend of your mother's," he told me. "I haven't seen her in a while. Is she around?"
"I'll go and get her for you,"
I told him. I ran into the trailer.
Mummy, you have a visitor."
"Who is it?" she asked.
"I don't know. He says he's an old friend of yours."
"An old friend?" said my mother, ambling over to the trailer door. When my mother saw the man standing outside our trailer, I was shocked, as her face drained of all its colour, growing as white as a piece of paper. She kept opening and closing her mouth rather like a startled goldfish, and then she said, "Douglas, is that really you? What on earth are you doing here? You're the last person I expected to see." "I've been a bloody fool, Yvette. Such a fool. What can I say? Can you forgive me for running off all those years ago?"
For a while my mother said absolutely nothing, but a sorry tear spilled down her cheek. "Of course I forgive you," she whispered. "There's nothing to forgive. We were young. It was understandable. You had a dreadful shock."
"I was an idiot," said Douglas. "An absolute idiot. There is no excuse for the way I behaved. I can't believe you didn't even come after me. Most women would have come after me for money, but you never did."
The next thing I knew, they were embracing. Tears were shed. My mother took Douglas into the woods for a walk. I heard her saying, "But I thought you were married and you had kids." In response, he chuckled.
"Are you kidding? You know you were always the love of my life. I just haven't had the courage to come back for you, after what I did. I was such a coward running off like that, but I was so afraid when you announced you were pregnant. I couldn't handle it. It was overwhelming for me. Recently I told my mother that the baby that you had is her grandchild. She was horrified with what I'd done. She was the one that encouraged me to have the nerve to come back and see you after all this time, and I'm so glad I did."
When my mother came back from her walk with Douglas in the woods, they were holding hands. My mother had a smile on her face so large, I was actually surprised it fit on her face. "We've something to tell you, love," she said, smiling at me. "This is your father, Douglas Lagerford."
"And what is your name?"
Douglas asked me. "My name is Riley. Are you really my daddy?"
"I'm really your daddy."
"You're not going to leave us, are you?" My father held me very lovingly in his arms. He bobbed me up and down on his knees, and he said,
"No, I'm never leaving you again."
And he was true to his word. Me and my mother moved back with him to Philadelphia. My mother married Douglas, and I had a very happy childhood, being raised by such beloved parents, but I never ever forgot my remarkable experience with the Bigfoot in the woods. The trailer park, the Coldeclare trailer park that is, no longer exists today. But it still exists in my mind, for I have never forgotten those Bigfoots. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, wasn't that the most incredible story? About how a young girl becomes mute because of a frightening encounter with a Bigfoot. And then it's a Bigfoot that helps her find a hiding place in the woods that makes her realize that she really didn't have anything to be afraid of at all. So until next time, goodbye and good night.